Hello, I'm Matthew from Leicester Library's Neighbourhood Services, and I'm here this morning to tell you a story. It's about a tailor. You can see him in your imagination. He's sitting at his work table in front of the big window where the light is the best. He's got a needle in the corner of his mouth and his glasses on the end of his nose, and he's marking out he's marking out the cloth with his tailor's chalk. Then he begins to cut with his scissors, and he takes his needle and he stitches and he sews and he stitches and he sews. One day the tailor was making a suit of clothes for the king. Now the king, he was obviously an important man and wealthy, and like is often the case for important and wealthy people, the king was used to the finest things in life. His food was cooked by the very best cooks. On feast days, only the most talented musicians and harpers would play for the king's guests. And of course, his clothes were made by the best tailor in the kingdom. And the tailor, he was finishing off the king's suit, and he folded the clothes carefully and he wrapped them, and he got on his horse and he rode to the palace. And there he was shown to the king, and he presented the suit of clothes. Your Majesty. The king was delighted. This was the most beautiful suit of clothes he'd ever owned. He was so happy that he wanted to give the tailor a reward, but what? He knew that the tailor was a humble man, and he wouldn't accept a single penny more than the price he'd already set for his work. The king tugged on his beard and he scratched his head, and he thought, maybe I could give him maybe a horse. Kings, they like to give horses away sometimes. But no, thought the king. He's already got a horse. He came to the palace today on a horse. He probably doesn't want the trouble of looking after and feeding 2 horses. No, it needs to be something else. Aha, then the king had an idea. He sent his best men down into the town to the market, and they came back, and the tailor was called in, and the king presented the tailor with the very finest bolt of cloth that you've ever seen. You are the finest tailor in all of my kingdom, he said. You are a marvellous maker of clothes for the lords and the ladies in my land, and even for myself, the king. And yet you dress in plain brown homespun cloth. Take this gift and make something fine for you yourself to wear. The tailor was delighted. He'd never had such beautiful cloth, not for himself. And he took it home and he laid it out on his work table under the big window, put his needle in the corner of his mouth, positioned his glasses, and he began to mark out the pattern with his tailor's chalk, and he cut out the material, and he began to stitch and sew and stitch and sew until he had made for himself a coat. The finest coat you have ever seen. And he wore that coat, and he wore that coat, and he wore that coat. Until one day he caught sight of himself in the mirror, and he realised that his fine coat had become worn and a little tatty. He took it off and held it up to the light, and when he looked again, he could see that it was only tatty and frayed around the edges, and that there was still enough good material there to make a jacket. So he laid it out on his work table. He took his tailor's chalk and he marked it out, and he cut out the shape of the jacket, and he took his needle and he stitched and he sewed and he stitched and he sewed until he had the finest jacket you have ever seen. And he wore that jacket, and he wore that jacket, and he wore that jacket, until one day he caught sight of himself in the mirror, and he realised that his jacket had become worn and frayed. He took it off and he held it up to the light, and when he looked again, he realised that it was only worn and frayed around the edges, and there was still enough good material there to make a waistcoat. And he took his chalk and his needle and his scissors and he marked out the pattern, and he cut out the shape of the waistcoat, and he his needle, and he stitched and he sewed and he stitched and he sewed until he had the finest waistcoat you have ever seen. And he wore that waistcoat and he wore that waistcoat and he wore that waistcoat until one day he caught sight of himself in the mirror, and he realised that his beautiful waistcoat had become worn and frayed, and he took it off and he held it up to the light, and he realised that there was just enough fabric there to make for himself a hat. And so he took his tailor's chalk and he marked out his pattern, and he cut out the material, and he took his needle and he stitched and he sewed and he stitched and he sewed and he stitched and he sewed until he'd made for himself a hat, a cap, the finest hat you have ever seen. And he wore that hat, and he wore that hat, and he wore that hat. But one day he caught sight of himself in a mirror, and he realised that his beautiful hat was becoming frayed and tatty around the edges, and he took it off and he held it up to the light, and he realised there was just enough fabric there to make for himself a button. And he took his chalk and he marked out the button, and he took his scissors and he cut out the material, and he stitched and he sewed and he stitched and he sewed and he stitched and he sewed until he had the finest button you have ever seen. And he wore that button and he wore that button and he wore that button until one day he caught sight of himself in the mirror, and he realised that his beautiful button was frayed and tattered. And he took it off and he held it into the light, and he thought about that button, and he thought about all the beautiful things he had from the cloth that had been given to him as a gift by his friend the king. He remembered his fine coat and his jacket and his waistcoat and his hat, and he looked now at the last scrap of that fabric, that tattered button, and he realised that he had there just enough material for a story. And he told that story, and he told that story, and he told that story. And unlike fabric, no matter how much you tell it, a story never wears out. In fact, it just becomes more glorious with every retelling. And the tailor told his story to the end of his days. And I heard that story from a storyteller somewhere else, and that is the story that I have just told you. The tailor, the most marvellous maker of clothes.